Welcome to this CDS SLRG lunchtime seminar. SLRG, for those who don't know, is the Sustainable Lifestyles Research Group programme directed by Tim Jackson at the back there. And a core part of what we try to understand in the SLRG is how we can reliably go about influencing people's values, attitudes and behaviours, one of the thorniest problems in sustainable development. And we've got a fantastic speaker on this today. Very delighted to introduce Dr. Rachel Howell from the University of Aberystwyth. I had the pleasure of being an external examiner on her PhD on exactly this theme a few months back. And Rachel's going to give an overview of what I think was very original, very striking, very informative research, which throws up a huge number of questions and could point us to all sorts of other research projects that maybe somebody in this room can take up. Rachel, great to have you here, and you're very welcome to speak.
Thank you very much, Ian. Great. Okay, so just to explain all these logos, as Ian said, I'm at the University of Aberystwyth, but my research for my PhD was undertaken mostly at Edinburgh, and also prior to that, the Environmental Change Institute in Oxford. And when Ian invited me to give this seminar, he asked, would I do an overview of the whole PhD? Because he thought it would all be of interest to people here. So while you normally get a seminar focusing on perhaps one paper or one research project, I am going to attempt this, a whistle-stop tour, and I hope you're going to find that okay. It does mean it's going to be sort of broad and a little bit superficial rather than going into depth, but what I am going to try and do is ensure that there's plenty of time for questions at the end. So you can choose for yourselves what you want to hear about more, what you want to grill me about, rather than me choosing which bit of my PhD you might find most interesting. So I did a thesis by papers which enabled me to link several related projects rather than work on one big project, which I found very useful. I don't know if that's something that you're allowed to do here, but I would thoroughly recommend it as a means of doing a PhD. And so I'm basically going to go through, in the order of my thesis, the projects I carried out and based on the papers that I wrote. So firstly, Lights, Camera, Action, that's a study of the impacts of a film, called The Age of Stupid. And then broadening that out a little bit, investigating the long-term impacts of climate change communications. And then broadening that out further, looking at more generally how films might encourage individual behaviour change. And those three papers and that particular project around films were essentially asking the question, here is an intervention, or here are some interventions, to use academic language, which were designed to encourage people to change their attitudes or their behaviour. And did that work, or how might they work? And then I turned the question around, and I went out and I interviewed people, essentially talking to people who have made changes to their lifestyle, who have adopted lower carbon behaviours, and trying to work out how, why, what motivated those people. So next paper is called It's Not Just the Environment Stupid. Very interesting results from my point of view about what motivated people. And finally, a project looking at the experience of people who are involved in carbon rationing action groups, who are voluntarily living with a carbon allowance. And then I'll bring it all together in an overall summary. By the way, if you want to ask questions as I go along, please do feel free. And also, I know I talk rather fast. If I'm going too fast, just wave at me. Before I actually start on the research, we need to ask this question. Why did I bother to look at individuals? Why was I interested in promoting lower carbon lifestyles to individuals? You know, there are people who ask, well, isn't it really about business and industry? These are figures from the Office of National Statistics. There are other breakdowns. I know that Angela has done work also on how you assign carbon emissions to different sectors. And here you can see that household energy at 20%, travel at 15%, and indirect emissions at 50%. Those are the emissions that are embedded in the products and services we buy. Okay, so on this consumption perspective, in other words, who is actually finally using the products and the services that are creating the carbon emissions, you can see that individuals really matter. Okay? Now, other people look at a production perspective, but this is why I was interested in looking at individuals. Because ultimately, it's what we choose to consume that creates carbon emissions. Okay, so the first project How many of you have seen The Age of Stupid? A few, okay. So this film came out in March 2009, and it's a very interesting film. It's got a fictional frame set in 2055. Pete Postlethwaite plays a guy who is one of the last people left in a world that has been absolutely devastated by climate change. Okay, and he is living in this tower that's been built in the Arctic Ocean as a repository for all the kind of culture of our civilization. So, you know, Michelangelo's David and things like this, they're all stored there. Quite why, in the breakdown of world civilization, we bothered to build this place, I don't know, but the point is that it allows for a situation where he is sitting as the archivist in this tower watching video footage from now. So he's looking back from the future at our time and asking, why didn't we save ourselves when we had the chance? So there are then 6 interweaving documentary strands, okay, which are explaining various different facets of the problem of our dependency on fossil fuels. So, for example, you've got the wind farm developer here in England who is being opposed. You've got this absolutely lovely 82-year-old French mountain guide who's seen the retreat of alpine glaciers by 15 metres in his lifetime. And you've got this very interesting guy here, Alvin Duvernay, who lives in New Orleans. And one thing I liked about the film is it's not a complete black and white film, because this guy is introduced as a kind of hero who saved the lives of about 100 people when Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. But he also works for Shell, finding oil. And when he's asked would he do it again, if he had his life to live over again, he says, sure I would. And yet it was him who gave the film its title, The Age of Stupid. He said, we'll look back and we will say we're living in the age of stupid. So it's quite a nuanced film, okay, with a lot of different strands of information, and other stories as well, which I won't go into. So, why was I interested in looking at this film? Well, literature tells us that affect, feelings about particular images and situations and so on, plays an important part in determining people's responses to environmental issues. It's not all just about what goes on intellectually. And so emotions and not just knowledge should be targeted by environmental education campaigns. That's what we've been told. Visual media offer many advantages for communicating motivating messages. Okay? Many studies suggest that fear-based appeals change attitudes and behavioural intentions. Okay? And this was certainly a fair appeal. The director said that she wanted people to come out of seeing this film feeling afraid and guilty. So, perhaps it would work. You know, interesting. But people need a sense of agency. Okay? They need to feel that they can do something about the problem and it's worth doing something about the problem. Protection motivation theory tells us that people change their behaviour in response to a fear appeal only when they believe specific behaviours will reduce the threat. And this film didn't offer a lot, it offered some, but not a lot by way of behaviours to reduce the threat. And I wondered whether it had such a gloom and doom tone that actually people would come out feeling it's too late or we're too little to do anything, or that kind of response. And people don't like feeling helpless. So climate change fear appeals can trigger denial, apathy, repression, anger, counterproductive defensive measures. There's a paper which says that in the States, people who feel threatened by climate change are more likely to go out and buy an SUV. You know, because climate change is associated with scary weather, and an SUV will protect you from the weather, although it will help create it. Okay, and then you've got this issue of cognitive dissonance, whereby if people feel that their concerns, their attitudes don't match their actions, or their actions don't match their concerns, what is easier to change, your behaviour or your attitudes? It's easier to change your attitudes, and so this is why people sometimes end up going into denial when they're faced with feeling that, you know, the guilt that the filmmaker wanted people to feel because of this film. And finally, a lot of studies of fear appeals are lab-based studies, very short term, and they have been criticised for not being enough about the real world. So I was interested in seeing, you know, what about a study that was done in a kind of real world situation. So I went to the Edinburgh Film House and I did before and after questionnaires. I pretty much lived there for a week. I got 241 respondents at 21 screenings of the film. I then got them to fill in a follow-up questionnaire. 162 people stayed in to fill in a follow-up questionnaire 10 to 14 weeks later. And then because there are very few studies looking longer term, and I wanted to catch up and see what had happened a year later, I actually did another follow-up, 15 months after people had seen the film, and for that 104 people stayed in. So, you know, reasonable response rate staying in, though we'll have a look at that a bit later. Now, I found that the film increased concern, which I expected, and also motivation to act, which I hadn't been sure about. 83% said they were a bit or a lot more concerned, and I had different statements for them to express their agreement with before and after, and statistical tests showed that people felt more motivated, were more likely to agree I can do something, and more likely to agree it's worth lobbying politicians about climate change. But that effect had worn off by the time of the follow-up surveys. It was a short-term effect. Now, what I was more interested in is, does this translate into action? It's all very well for people to feel more concerned, but is it actually going to make any difference to what people do? So I asked about 20 different actions in these 4 areas: awareness raising, lobbying, home energy use, travel and food. I also had an open question so people could tell me about other things apart from my 20 behaviours. And those were ranked sort of from easier to more complicated or more costly behaviours. Now, the interpretation of my results depends on whether you have a glass half full or a glass half empty view of life. I tend towards glass half empty. So what I would notice is that for every action I asked about, the proportion of people who said that they were doing it because of seeing the film was small. And that proportion decreased as the behaviours got more costly in terms of time, effort or money. But if I was the filmmaker, what I would be pointing out is that for everything I asked about, at least 1% and sometimes up to 29% said that they were doing it because of seeing the film. So, for example, 12% reckoned they were driving less, 18% buying more local produce, 22% said that they had decided to stop or reduce holiday flying long term. That's quite an important effect if that was carried out. And we'll come back to whether that's carried out later. An important thing to stress is that respondents were not the general public. They tended to be green heroes like this guy here. Okay, so they expressed very high levels of concern and motivation before seeing the film. Over a third of them were actually involved in a group campaigning about climate change. And so we can't really test whether we can be sure that this fear appeal didn't put people off acting, because in fact the film very likely presented information that they were already familiar with, and because they were involved in campaigning groups, they knew what to do. They weren't stuck with shocking information that they didn't really know what to do with. So these results can't be generalised to the general public, which is, that did not surprise me actually. Okay, so then my second paper analysed the results of the long-term follow-up and was partly about those results, but is a more methodological paper for various reasons. The first thing I want to point out is, you probably can't read this at the back, but it's basically showing the proportion of respondents in the sample from questionnaire 1 and 2 in the film house, the first follow-up and the second follow-up, and their answers on the first questionnaire to certain questions. So, for example, by the time of the last follow-up, there were more people in the survey who had come to see the film because they were concerned about climate change. There were more people who had originally said they are very concerned about climate change. There were more people who were involved in a group that campaigns about climate change. In other words, the most committed, motivated people were the ones who were most likely to stay in the study. And again, that's a common effect, but it's worth pointing out. Now, in terms of behavioural changes, what I found was that if you trust what people were saying, that their self-reported behaviours, and of course there is an issue about self-reported behaviours, they generally persisted with changes they'd made as a result of seeing the film. That didn't die out. There were possibly a few late starters, by which I mean people who, on the third survey, said that they weren't taking an action, but on the last survey said, I am taking this action because of seeing the film. Now, for some actions, that's believable. If you, for example, are going to change your diet, cut down on eating meat, it might actually take a few weeks. It might take even 2 or 3 months for you to sort of begin to do that. For others, I think that's just misremembering, and in fact there were so few people that could just be kind of survey noise. And then coming back to this issue of the flying, because I was asking people a whole year later, I was able to find out how their behaviour matched their intentions. So on the third question, I had two questions. Do you intend to not to fly this coming year for holiday? And then, do you intend to cut down or reduce long-term flying? A year later, I was able to ask them about their actual behaviour in the preceding year. And what I found was that behavioural intentions do not necessarily lead to action. There's no correlation, no statistically significant result between what people had intended to do and what they actually did. Okay. But perhaps the most important result, and the one which led me to write a more methodological paper, was that respondents' causal attributions of their behaviour are unreliable. What I found was a significant proportion of my sample was saying on questionnaire 4 that they were taking action as a result of seeing the film, that on questionnaire 3 they were saying they were taking but not because of seeing the film. So with the passage of time, people had forgotten. Why were they likely to attribute their behaviour to the results of seeing the film? Could be various reasons. They might have been on board with it and wanted to think it had a good impact. It might be because some of them had actually travelled from places like St Andrews or whatever to see the film, and people like to feel that if they've made an effort to do something that it has influenced them. So basically this paper I wrote was about the difficulties and the challenges of doing long-term research that tries to look at the impacts of interventions. Sorry, that's just to remind you that we have short memories actually. So, implications. Firstly, there's the issue of the recruitment and retention of participants who are not the converted. Now, I could have paid people to come and see this film and got a random representative sample, but I decided not to do that because I wasn't actually that interested in seeing what impact the film would have on people who wouldn't have seen it otherwise, because we can't force people to see films. But if you do want to get a random representative sample, you are looking at shelling out quite significant resources to recruit them. Behavioural intentions cannot be assumed to be proxies for actual behaviour, and they often are. A lot of studies actually draw conclusions about behaviour when actually all they've looked at is intentions. Requesting causal self-attributions adds another layer of complexity to problems which we already know about with self-report measures. The collection of data can influence respondents' action. It's possible that by asking people about action on questionnaire 3 that I actually even prompted people to do things. One person did actually say in the open section that my questionnaire had prompted him to think about things to do. And then, of course, isolating the impacts of one intervention over time. Other things happen. Okay, there are lots of media stories. There's cuts in funding for things. So many things happen. But we do, I think, somehow have to find a way to develop methodologies for doing this kind of research, because we do need to know about long-term impacts, and we do need to know about behaviour and not just attitudes. Okay. So then I wanted to broaden this out. So far I looked at one film, but I wanted to consider more generally how might films encourage individual behaviour change. So I did a sort of more desk-based study looking at these 4 very different films. This was a Hollywood blockbuster with a climate change disaster theme, completely silly when it comes to climate science, but quite engaging. That's Al Gore's film. Very interesting because quite old-fashioned in a sense. An awful lot of it is just him delivering a lecture. Adrian Stupid we talked about, and this one on the end, very, very interesting film, where the director embedded herself for a year with 3 different campaign groups: Climate Rush, Plain Stupid, and Climate Camp. And so it's not a film about the problem of climate change like these other 3. It's actually a film about climate activism, about people who are taking action for what they see as the solutions, opposing fossil fuels, campaigning for stronger climate change policy. Now, I analysed this using a model taken from health psychology called the trans-theoretical model, which I prefer as the stages of change model. And this model basically posits that when people are changing their behaviour kind of intentionally, they move from pre-contemplation, they don't recognise they've got a problem, or they're not thinking that it's worth addressing. Contemplation, thinking about the problem, thinking about the pros and cons of taking action. Preparation for taking action. Actually taking the action. And then maintenance, which is when you've been taking the action for more than 6 months and you're simply maintaining a new habit, but there is still some effort involved in maintaining that new habit. And this is not an entirely linear process, because as you can see, you can relapse back. But anyway, the really interesting thing to me about this model is that it also suggests that there are several different processes of change that can be used, and that different processes of change are more useful and more likely to be used at different stages of change. Okay? Now these are more kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of psychologically based things. What goes on in your head or your heart? So awareness, dramatic relief is about emotional engagement, re-evaluation of self or environment. And then over here you've got more practical things, helping relationships. Contingency management is about having sticks and carrots. Counter-conditioning is about learning alternative behaviours. Okay. So I looked at these films, I analysed what they were doing in terms of the characters presented, the storylines, the music and all that was going on in the background, and looked at the processes of change they were either using or depicting. And what I found was that all of the films did this. They all raised awareness and engaged people emotionally. They mostly tried to encourage environmental and self-re-evaluation. A couple of them showed self-liberation, which is about people deciding they can change and doing, making a decision that they will do so. But only one, Only Just Do It, really showed anything to do with helping relationships. Okay? And none of these other processes were depicted. Okay, so now what you can see is that the films, in general, were using more processes of change that are suitable for people who are early stages of change. But when I looked at not just my own research on The Age of Stupid, but other people's research on the other films, quite a few of them were getting an audience that were more towards the later stages of change. Okay? Now, not a film like The Day After Tomorrow, that being a Hollywood blockbuster, that got people who weren't even particularly interested in climate change. So that's, in many ways, a good film to be using these processes of change, although unfortunately it confused people because its climate science was silly. Okay? But what I came to the conclusion was these films employ or depict several processes of change that the model suggests should encourage attitudinal and behaviour change. That consciousness raising and dramatic relief, emotional engagement, are the processes most frequently associated with them, so films are most useful for people at early stages of change. Okay. And therefore we need to get people who are at early stages of change to see them. Consciousness raising and self-re-evaluation are best done by characters the audience can relate to. So for example, Al Gore's film, there was research done in the States which I think not surprisingly showed that there were far more Democrats said that that had influenced their thinking than Republicans. Why? Because Republicans can't relate to Al Gore. And similarly in The Age of Stupid, not everyone could relate to Piers the wind farm developer. Not everyone liked him. So people need to see people that they can relate to who are passing on the message or who are re-evaluating their behaviour and acting as models for how we could do that. Self-liberation could be emphasised more, that pivotal process between thinking about change and beginning it. We need more films where we see people going through that process. And if filmmakers are keen to promote action rather than just attitudinal change, they could perhaps look to portraying more of the variety of processes that help to support and maintain behavioural change. So more of those processes at this end of the table when I had it up. Right, that's it, moving swiftly on. As I said, I then turned the whole question around. I went and talked to people about how and why they had changed their lifestyles. So I talked to people involved in carbon rationing action groups and carbon conversations, and also in order to balance my sample and get a good mix in terms of age and backgrounds and so on, I did go and find some people who had already taken part in my Age of Stupid survey. It was a small sample, but it was a very diverse sample, good mix of ages, gender, backgrounds, household ownership or whatever, that kind of thing that can make a difference to people's energy behaviours. They were all middle class, university educated, which is absolutely par for the course for involvement in this country in these kind of movements. They weren't all necessarily on the sort of incomes you'd expect for a middle class people. And these were really, really in-depth interviews. They were narrative interviews to begin with, so I'd go in and I'd ask people, what have you been doing to cut your carbon footprint? And then I'd ask them to tell me the story from wherever you think it starts of how you have come to make this change. And some people would start the story right back in childhood, and some people would start the story very shortly before they actually made the change. And these were some of the themes that came out. So a big theme was social justice. I'm going to read some quotes, and I'm using pseudonyms. So M said, I thought about it in terms of aiming to take not more than my share. We are stealing from the poor. We are killing them with our indulgence. Aileen, it was more responsibility for the world and an awareness of how climate change affects the poorest people, and so on. I think sometimes people don't make the connection to do with poverty. They think of it more just about the environment per se rather than the actual impact on people. And similarly, when I asked people about how they'd become engaged, how they'd become concerned, they were talking about routes through human rights concerns and social justice concerns. So for example, Sally, especially looking at women's rights across the developing world, there was a certain point when I was reading and learning about stuff, it just became totally obvious to me that the ability of people to be able to live well and to make progress was completely dependent on their environment. I think it was when I made that link that I then immediately came up against climate change and thought, because of climate change, all the things we've tried to achieve in making improvements in the way that people farm, and to women's rights in developing countries especially, that would all just fall apart, and was already beginning to fall apart because of climate change. It was probably actually feminism which brought me into climate change. Somebody else explained that she'd come into it through Amnesty International, meeting environmentalists within Amnesty International, and somebody else explained that he had been brought up in South Africa and had been brought up with a consciousness of racial justice issues, and that had actually led him to concern about climate change. Next, a lesser theme, but still an important one, was about community, and this I'm distinguishing from social justice because it's a more local sort of sense of connection with others. So, for example, when she was asked, why do you care about climate change? Why are you taking action even though it doesn't matter? Or even though, sorry, it doesn't matter, even though you think it doesn't make much difference? Prue said, well, one is a feeling of being part of the community. A guy called Ian said, I think once you start getting involved in community stuff, and I'm heavily involved in local community stuff, I think you become more socially responsible. And they were also talking about the importance of community and how taking part in climate action had led them to community, had led them to feel more connected. So it was a benefit as well as an important motivator. Now, a third issue was about frugality. And this, I should stress, was not something that came about because they were taking climate action. In general, they were explaining to me that long before they were concerned about climate change, they had had a sort of desire to live simply, or had just naturally sort of wanted to get out of the rat race. So, again, I don't really have that much of a need to buy stuff or an urge to buy stuff. I'm quite happy wandering around in old clothes. So it's very easy for me to be contented with the lifestyle in which I buy second-hand clothes and things and don't do foreign travel, because I don't really enjoy either of those things. Then a guy called Paul explained he had started from a quite different place. I went through my teens being pretty materialistic, actually. I think certainly part of it, i.e. being a person concerned about climate change, is going through that and then just realising it isn't actually making me happy. Now, I also asked them about how they talked about climate change with others and about what climate change, the phrase climate change, meant to them. If I said climate change, what first comes to mind, I asked them. Now here I got what I found to be really interesting responses. These are people who are incredibly engaged in climate change. Some of these people work for climate change campaigns or have set up groups or whatever. But what they were saying to me was, at the moment the phrase climate change irritates me. I think it's become a cliche and it's almost its own worst enemy. Paul said, I often find that even just saying climate change turns people off. I go on to the other side of it, trying to talk about the solutions without even talking about the problem. And I think my favourite quote is a woman called Deepta. I'm not that interested in climate change as a person. I don't think it's actually that relevant, and I think in some ways it can be unhelpful. but because it becomes this thing which we either believe in or don't, or care about or don't. It fosters the view of something that we have to do because we're destroying the planet, and that's how she said it. Not because we genuinely want something that's better. So she wasn't really motivated by climate change at all. She was motivated by a much broader vision. And this is where we get on to when I asked them, what does a low carbon lifestyle mean to you? Quite a few of them gave me a to-do list, a list of things to do or to have, or more commonly to not have. But some of my interviewees were giving me a much broader picture. So they were saying things like this. Somehow I see sunshine. Yeah, lightness actually. Brightness and a sort of small place to live. Green grass and everything bright. There's something healthy about that. Healthy and wholesome, I suppose. Or else, Paul? So yeah, a less materialistic lifestyle. So we don't need to have so much, and hopefully meaning that we don't need to work so much. And then of course, this quote here. Now, that kind of vision doesn't translate into tons of carbon saved per year. Okay? But it is a more motivating vision, it seems, for some people. Now, having done some analysis, coding and so on, quantitative analysis of the interview scripts, I then decided I would try and check out what I felt I was seeing by doing a survey, quantitative data collection. So I sent them all a questionnaire which is based on the well-known Schwartz Values Survey. This is a questionnaire developed by De Groot and Steg, which basically looks at biospheric, altruistic and egoistic values. And what I found was that the top rated value was social justice, and that the mean of the altruism scale was greater than the mean of the biospheric scale. So in other words, in general, my interviewees were valuing were valuing altruistic values like helpfulness more than they were valuing the environment per se and values such as connectedness to nature. Which kind of I felt, I'm losing my words, kind of agreed with what I found in the qualitative study. So, as the Metro decided to report this result, people rather than polar bears inspire green lifestyles. That's not to say they didn't have biospheric values, that wasn't important to them. They were concerned about things like biodiversity loss and so on. But when I asked them the question, if we lived in a really weird world in which climate change would impact polar bears but not people, do you think you would be as concerned? Do you think you would have made all these changes? Most of them said, I wouldn't have gone as far as I have done. So the implications, altruistic values might be as useful as biospheric ones, and if there are more people in the population who hold strong altruistic values, that might be worth using. Now, of course, just finding that my sample had strong altruistic values doesn't prove that everyone does, and there are lots of aspects of our culture that are inimical to altruistic values, but the point is, at the moment, it's being suggested we need to get people to connect with nature, we need to get them to have that kind of sense of caring for the earth for the sake of the earth, and perhaps that won't be necessary. Perhaps we can work more with people's concern about other people. So, for example, climate change campaigns could make more links with altruistic organisations, for example, those working for refugee or women's rights, or religious groups that promote altruistic values but haven't perhaps yet or as much got into environmental issues. This finding about frugality suggests that people who are already frugal find it easier to change their lifestyles. So possibly we need a fundamental shift away from a kind of materialistic consumerist culture. And you know, I'm somewhat persuaded by people like Tim Casser who are suggesting that one way to tackle climate change would be to ban advertising in public places. You know, it might not be an obvious connection, but he's suggesting that the kind of consumerist culture we've got is actually a big problem. And then this whole thing about people's visions suggests that climate change communications need to encourage people to imagine a holistic and positive vision for a lower carbon future, and not just give a to-do list, and especially not just give a to-do list to combat climate change. Because, you know, if that isn't the motivating force behind people who really have made changes to their lifestyle, is it going to be a motivating force for the kind of the more general public? And a good example, I think, of that kind of thing is the transition town movement, which has a very empowering kind of rhetoric and many different reasons for getting involved. Okay, final project. This was looking at people involved in carbon rationing action groups, and I saw them earlier, who are living with a carbon allowance. So these are small groups of ordinary, concerned individuals. They calculate their carbon footprint and set themselves a carbon ration every year. Some groups have a financial penalty for people who go over that ration. And the reason for this study is that I was asked to do it by the Environmental Change Institute in Oxford, who are interested in personal carbon trading or personal carbon allowances. And CRAGs are the nearest thing in existence to a personal carbon trading scheme. Okay, a personal carbon trading scheme would involve every person in this country having an allowance and needing to buy extra allowances if they wanted to emit more than their allowed fair share of carbon emissions. So I went off, I did 23 interviews with people involved in 10 different CRAGs of various kinds. So mostly urban, but there was a village CRAG, there was a workplace-based CRAG. Some of them had been going quite a long time, some of them were new startups. There was one that failed that I was interested to see why. Some of them were doing some rudimentary form of trading and others weren't. Some of them had per capita allowances, but some of them had decided to allow people to either choose their own allowance or were having a sort of everyone making the same decrease rather than decreasing to the same amount. So quite varied. And this is what CRAGs achieved in the first year. So they started off, I think this is interesting, with a carbon footprint, an average carbon footprint, not much lower than the UK average. Okay, so even though they were very concerned, they weren't behaving that differently. And in the first year, they made a really significant cut. Now, the caveat that this graph actually depends on an assumption that the extra members who joined during year one had an average baseline footprint the same as the original 33. If they didn't, if they had a lower carbon footprint when they joined, then that doesn't hold. So unfortunately I wasn't able to get the data. But my experience of talking to CRAGs is that actually most of them do make really significant cuts in the first year, generally through cutting out flying.
Rachel, what's in that footprint? It's
not a
total.
Sorry, yes. A good question. It's direct emissions. It's emissions from transport of all kinds and electricity and gas and so on at home. So it's not the embedded emissions from what you buy. Too complicated to try and measure. Thanks for that. Okay, very quickly, key findings from this study. Motivated individuals can make significant reductions in their direct greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, that's important to know. Can people actually, do something about their carbon footprint, or do they find themselves blocked? Now, the really interesting thing is that the longest running CRAGs have now been running for 6 or 7 years, and I was talking recently with the guy who started them and who is still going in the Glasgow CRAG, and he tells me they've now plateaued. They have got down to an average of 2.9 tonnes, I think, and that's it. That's how far they can get, and they can't get lower than that without more infrastructural change or whatever. Another, I think, interesting finding, given that these people were quite concerned beforehand, is that being involved in the CRAG did improve their carbon literacy quite significantly. So not only through greater awareness of energy use and related emissions, but also having a carbon footprint statement really helps people to understand the relative impacts of different aspects of their lifestyle. And I think this is very, very important. This is, for example, what is not going to be achieved by carbon labelling, or by having a statement on your electricity bill about how much carbon emissions are associated with it. That's a start, but just knowing what a particular activity, what impact that has, is not nearly as useful as seeing a whole statement, so you can understand which bit of your lifestyle is the bit that's really clogging up the emissions. Another interesting thing is that many of the groups decided that equal per capita allowances were not necessarily seen as fair. Now, I think most people sort of instinctively feel that everyone having the same emissions allowances is fair, but then you get into all sorts of problems about what about elderly people who are at home more and need the heating on more, or what about people who live in rural areas and need to travel more? Is that fair because they've chosen to live there, or is it not fair because they made that choice before this whole problem became salient, and so on and so on. So that could be an interesting finding for any future policies. And being part of a group is helpful for many reasons, especially moral support, increased sense of agency and information sharing. It really reduces the information load to be in a group, but also you have a sense, well, you know, I've cut my footprint by this much, but our group has cut it by 10 times that much, and if I think about CRAGS as a whole, much more than that. But CRAGS can't tell us much about personal carbon trading policy because only 2 groups were doing any kind of rudimentary trading, and of course the people involved are, again, not the general public. So, as I say, that was quite a whistle-stop tour. Overall, clearly the people who were involved in all my projects were not the general public, and we need to engage more of the population in action on climate change, in my opinion. We can't just be this sort of enclave of the converted. As I said, there's a possibility to make common cause with organisations who are concerned about social justice and human rights and expand the sense, get across to people climate change is not an environmental issue. When I go off and do talks, I did a talk for some nuns, for example, a while ago, and I asked them, do you think I've come here to talk about environmental issues? And they said yes. And I said, well, I've come here to talk about climate change, and climate change is not an environmental issue. It's an everything issue. It's also important to emphasise the non-environmental benefits of low-carbon lifestyles, but research suggests don't therefore just stress the financial benefits. Now that's not something that's come out of my own research, that's stuff that's being suggested by, for example, Tom Crompton, WWF, and their work on Common Cause, all about values and framing, that we shouldn't be looking just to talk about money because that might cause problems in the long term. In terms of climate change communications, particularly films, we need to recruit different audiences to see them. Now, for example, you can promote films in schools if you want to capture people who might be at earlier stages of change. The problem with that, of course, is that children do not have so much agency. They don't have so much control over things. But personally, I think that the primary role for climate change communications is to encourage and reinforce public concern so that politicians act. I don't think we can expect that films, however dramatic, or other kinds of communications, however wacky and eye-catching, will actually make huge differences to behaviour across a wide spectrum of people. So personally, I would conclude that there is a real need for serious top-down legislation that will impact on everyday practices and behaviours. So that's it. As I said, I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. Those are the 5 papers associated with my work, if you're interested in them. And I also have here a 3-page summary of my thesis of what I've been saying. So if you're interested, then please take one of these, whether it's because you're interested in the content or because you're, you know, doing a research project yourself and want to see a kind of a model of how to cut a 300-page thesis down to a 3-page summary. So I'll hand those around.